Hi everyone, it's Anna here from Journeys. This week's AAA Ask Anna Anything question. This one is about culture and vulnerability, and the question was, any tips to set a culture of vulnerability when the space doesn't feel safe? So this is about, again, group, culture. It might be at work or maybe in your family or some kind of space where you want to set a culture of vulnerability, but the space itself or the place itself doesn't actually feel safe. What do we need to do to build that culture? So I'm not an expert in culture. There are people who are, experts in culture change and all those sorts of things. But I've got a few things that came to my mind when I read this question. The first one that came to mind was around education and educating the group or the environment, the team, whatever it is, about vulnerability in the first place. So talking about what is vulnerability, what vulnerability is, what it isn't. What are the myths about vulnerability? For example, one of them from Brené Brown's work is that people think that vulnerability is weakness. And yet all of the examples that people gave to her in the research of what vulnerability actually is were really acts of courage. And so alongside vulnerability is actually strength and courage. It's not weakness at all. So I think often people don't want to share and they don't want to be vulnerable because they think, if I share that hard thing that I'm going through, then I'm actually showing my weakness. So there needs to be some education around what is actually vulnerability. Alongside that, part of the education and part of the process is about trust building. So we know from research that we should only be vulnerable with people who have earned the right to hear our story. And that's the words that Brené uses in her research. But really what that's talking about is, do we trust someone with our story? Do we trust someone with what it is that's going on in our life? And how do we know that we can trust them to share vulnerably with them? So what we need to look at, I think, is, I always say trust and vulnerability go hand in hand, right? It's not about I have to wait till I can fully trust someone before I share anything, or I have to share everything so that they'll trust me. It works hand in hand. And I kind of, for myself and talk about, I think that when we think about the things going on in our life, there are really deep things that we need a lot of trust with someone when we share with them that particular part of our story. There are also other things that maybe aren't as deep and are a little bit more matter of fact. They might still be a challenge or they might still be vulnerable, but not at a really deep vulnerability level. So I think trust and vulnerability go hand in hand, and they kind of moves up and down depending on what's going on in your relationship. And the other thing about trust is that the research shows that trust is built in small moments. So when I'm thinking, if I trust someone, then I'm going to share vulnerably with them. But I also need to see that they trust me and that it's reciprocated, and that what are they doing to show me that I can actually trust them? And what am I doing to show them that they can trust me? So trust is one of these interesting concepts that it's built in small moments. It's not about big gestures that need to be done to show that you trust someone. The other thing about culture and setting a culture of vulnerability is, I think those of us who want to set a culture of vulnerability, we need to be vulnerable. Brené talks about how courage is contagious. And so if being vulnerable is actually courageous, then the more we share, the more that we be vulnerable with those who have earned the right to hear our story, the more that's going to encourage other people to also be vulnerable. So I think we need to demonstrate it as well. And the last thing is to just remember that this stuff takes time. So you can't expect a culture to suddenly be vulnerable in a really short period of time. It takes time, and vulnerability is really hard to practice. It's something that takes time even with individual groups and individual relationships, let alone a group and a culture in general from a bigger group of people. So it will take time for this culture to actually build. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.